to another training. This week we're going to talk about dopamine. Okay, last week we were talking about cell phones and how they're so addicting. Okay, and we talked a lot about the scarcity loop that our brain has been created and why. Just like when it comes to gambling, right? How the opportunities created and then these unpredictable rewards keep us trapped on this habit loop, okay? And we were talking about how cell phones are destroying relationships, marriages, and for men, their fatherhood, their presence with their kids. Now, I'm going to talk to you today about dopamine and why this neurotransmitter is so important. We're going to dive a little bit deeper. I've been talking about it on some of the other podcasts and some of the other trainings, but today we're going to talk about why it's so hard to break those habits and how can we actually break it the more we understand this very special molecule known as dopamine, okay? Or neurotransmitter for that matter. So before we jump in today, guys, if you don't know me, my name is 𝘠𝘩𝘢𝘪. I'm a best-selling author, coach. I'm a father. I've been married for almost 15 years now. And my story was, I was broken. After 10 years of being married, I was on the brink of divorce, thought I was going to get divorced. My wife gave me an ultimate challenge and said, you got to fix this marriage. You got to turn this around. Otherwise, we're done. And this was after 10 years of just up and down turmoil. I honestly didn't think it was fixable. And it wasn't until, I had already invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in training and coaching and mentors. So I really didn't think it was possible. 4 years of therapy. Like, what else could I possibly do? And I really believed that my wife and my kids needed to change, and it wasn't me. And when I embarked on this journey one last time, I was able to radically change it in just 3 months. And it blew me away because I'm like, I've done so much work. What changed this time? And when after a year passed, I actually reverse engineered what I did. And I was like, can I teach this to other men? Because I hear so many men reaching out to me saying, hey, I'm dealing with the same problem. I'm like, wow, can I actually teach this? Because is this a framework that I get lucky? And what I realized is that marriage is a skill, fatherhood is a skill. If you want to level up, you want to learn how to build an unshakable marriage and deeper connection with your kids, I'll show you how. Simply drop me a line after this or comment below, and I'm happy to get you the details and get you rolling. All right, let's talk about dopamine, okay? So the brain, this is what happens. The brain encodes long-term memories of rewards and their associated cues by changing the shape and size of dopamine producing neurons. So for example, the dendrites that you learned about when you were in grade school that branches off of the neuron, they become longer and more numerous in response to high dopamine rewards, okay? This process is called experience-dependent plasticity. And these brain changes can last a lifetime and they persist long after the drug is no longer available. This is really important. So just because you stop doing a drug, you're going to hear more, but pathways are already encoded and embedded in our brain, which is why when you take a hit again of a drug, it's so easy to get re-addicted. So researchers, they explored this and they showed the effects of cocaine exposure on rats by injecting them with the same amount of cocaine on successive days for a week and then measuring how much they ran in response to each injection. So a rat injected with cocaine will run across a cage instead of keeping to the periphery like normal rats do. And what the scientists found was that with each successive day of cocaine exposure, the rats progressed from a lively jog on the first to an outright running frenzy on the last, showing that a cumulative sensitization to the effects of cocaine. Now, once the researchers stopped administering the cocaine, the rats stopped running. 1 year later, a veritable lifetime for a rat, okay, the scientists re-injected the rats with cocaine just one time, and the rats were immediately running as they had on the final day of the original experiment. And so when the scientists examined the rats' brains, they saw cocaine-induced changes in the rats' reward pathways, consistent with the persistent cocaine sensitization. Now, these findings show that a drug like cocaine can alter the brain forever. So, some brain changes due to addiction, they're irreversible. But here's some good news, okay? It's actually possible to detour around these damaged areas by creating new neural networks. We can actually find new synaptic pathways to create healthy behaviors, okay? So that's the really key part. It is fixable. Now let's talk about what I like to call the abundance factor. Our brains have evolved to the world of plenty, right? We have more than enough right now. We have instantaneous gratification, 2-day shipping, all these kind of things. So Dr. 𝘠𝘕𝘓, who studies diabetes in the setting of chronic sedentary feeding, said, we are at the cacti in the rainforest. And like cacti adapted to an arid climate, we are drowning in dopamine. And so the net effect is that we now need more reward to feel pleasure and less injury to feel pain. So the question is, how do we survive and thrive in this new ecosystem? How do we raise our children, right? Here's the key. dopamine fasting. And I took this from the book Dopamine Nation by Anna Lembke, who I interviewed on my podcast, The Joel Evans Show. You can go back and check out that episode. She's a Stanford professor, dives deep into addiction, and she's been doing clinical work as well as she's a professor. And she outlined it like this. There's a great acronym called dopamine. Okay, so D is for data. We've got to get analytical. We've got to get objective about this. What does the data say? What are we seeing objectively, right? Number 2 is you need to look at O, objectives. What does the habit do for you? How does it help you? Okay. P, this is for problems. You guys notice, by the way, I'm spelling out the word dopamine. Okay. So P is for problems. What's it costing you? Okay. A is for abstinence. It's necessary to actually restore homeostasis by abstaining from something. Okay. So actually neuroscientist 𝘠𝘠𝘀𝘀 showed that dopamine transmission is still below normal 2 weeks after quitting drugs. So 2 weeks of abstinence is not enough. At 2 weeks, patients are usually still experiencing a withdrawal, and they are still in a dopamine deficit state. Now, on the other hand, 4 weeks, it's often sufficient. So Mark Shuktik and his colleagues, they studied a group of men who were drinking alcohol daily in large quantities and also met criteria for clinical depression, or what's called major depressive disorder. Okay. Now, after 1 month of not drinking, 80% no longer met the criteria for clinical depression. Also, something to note is that a minority of patients, about probably 20%, don't feel better after the dopamine fast. Now, this is important data too because it tells us that the drug wasn't the main driver of the psychiatric symptom and that the patient likely had a co-occurring psychiatric disorder that will require its own treatment. Very critical there. All right, the M in dopamine, mindfulness. Now, this is simply the ability to observe what our brain is doing while it's doing it without any judgment, without any shame, without any blame. The trick is to stop running away from painful emotions and instead allow ourselves to tolerate them. And when we're able to do this, our experience takes on a new and unexpected rich texture. So the pain's still there, but somehow we're able to transform it or transmute it. And this starts to bring around, kind of encompass a vast landscape of communal suffering rather than just being like wholly like this is just our own suffering, right? The I in dopamine, insight. So 4 weeks after, 4 weeks of abstaining from a behavior is going to give you some clarifying insight into your behaviors, right? So take note of that. Review what you're learning. Review and see what you've actually seen, right? Insight. N is for next steps. So can you use the drug in a more controlled way in the future? Which I know seems counterintuitive because we just said that those pathways are created, but we need to start looking at next steps and future planning. Like, hey, you've been able to abstain for this much. Can you continue to abstain, or can we see with even like a controlled dosage, a limited amount of exposure, are you able to then slowly wean off? Now, there's some controversy there because we don't want to go back down that route, but they have seen success from studies with controlled exposure. That's something to consider. E is for experiment. So go back into the world now with the knowledge that you have and you're armed with a plan, and now figure out how you can actually maintain this, okay? And there you go, guys. Dopamine. So use that acronym, and if you want like a full sheet, I can send that to you. Just comment below and I'll send you this actual cheat sheet so you can use it in your own life in your dopamine fasting. Now, one of the things we need to talk about, we talked about that's one way to stop it. Now I want to go dive into one last piece and then we'll wrap things up. But how can we set up boundaries and barriers so that we can limit that dopamine and bring us back to a baseline? We need to create tangible barriers between ourselves and whatever our drug of choice is. We need to be able to press that pause button. And I'm going to give you 3 ways that you can do this. And these are strategies that Anna Lembke talks about too, and that she's seen that work in her clinical practice as well, not just theory, okay? There's 3 things. Number 1 is physical strategies, creating space between you and your habit. Number 2 is chronological strategies. How do we create time as a buffer or barrier? And then 3 is categorical strategies, which is really meaning behind your habit or destructive behavior. So physical strategies simply remove your ability to actually do the habit, right? That's obvious. If you're someone who drinks alcohol, don't buy the alcohol. Like, keep it out of your cabinets. Make it really inaccessible. Of course, you're going to say, Joel, I can just go to the store and buy it. Well, yeah, of course, but you've created at least a physical barrier. That makes it a little bit more difficult, and you don't have the easy access to just grabbing it. Other things you could look at is medications like naltrexone. Okay, they've used this to help treat alcohol and opioid addiction, and it's being used for a variety of other addictions as well, from gambling to overeating to shopping. Okay, now naltrexone, what it does is it blocks the opioid receptor, which in turn diminishes those reinforcing effects of the different types of rewarding. So the opioid pathway is different than the dopamine pathway, just so you understand. But here's the neat thing. When you want something, that's dopamine. When you get whatever it is, you're enjoying your piece of chocolate, that's the opioid system being calmed down and being stimulated. So if we can diminish that pathway, even if you were to get whatever it is, you wouldn't feel the effects of it. So it wouldn't have that draw to you. So because naltrexone is blocking that endogenous opioid system, people have reasonably wondered if it might induce depression, and that's something to be aware of. Some people say they don't feel the habit, the urge to do their habit, but they do have they do feel limited, and sometimes in other areas they don't get the same thing. Like as runner's high has been like an example where they don't feel as alive. So you have to be mindful of that. It might diminish some other reward pathways as well, but it has been shown to be helpful with whatever it is blocking the habit that you've created. Now, chronological strategies is the second one. So here's an example. By restricting consumption to certain times of the day, week, month, year, we can narrow our window of consumption and thereby just limit its use. So for example, we can tell ourselves that we're only going to consume this food or beverage on holidays, or only on weekends, or never before Thursday, or never before 5 p.m., and so on and so forth. Now, neuroscientists S.H. Ahmed and George Koob have shown that rats given unlimited access to cocaine for 6 hours per day gradually would increase their level, pressing over time to the point of physical exhaustion and even death. Increased self-administration under extended access conditions, like 6 hours, has also been observed with methamphetamines, nicotine, heroin, and alcohol. However, rats who have access to cocaine for only 1 hour per day use steady amounts of cocaine over many consecutive days. That is, that they don't press the lever for more drug per unit of time with each consecutive day. So that can be helpful. We see that in studies. Also, delay discounting or delay gratification. This could be another big strategy, and it's interesting what happens to the brain too. So when you delay gratification, the value of the reward goes down longer than when we have to wait for it. So obviously, most of us would want $20 a day for today, right now, than a year from now. And so the study suggests that by restricting drug consumption to a narrow window of time, we may be able to moderate our use and avoid compulsive and escalating consumption that comes with unlimited access. Now, when neuroscientists look at the brain and what parts of the brain are involved in choosing immediate versus delayed rewards, they found that when participants chose an immediate reward, emotion and reward processing parts of the brain were lighting up. When participants delayed their reward, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's involved in planning and abstract thinking and logical decision making, became active. So here's the implication here is how vulnerable we are to prefrontal cortical atrophy, as our reward pathway has become the dominant driver of our lives. And interestingly enough, the drugs or the substance that you're addicted to makes you less present and future forward thinking. Opioid addiction studies showed, and that subjects who were addicted referred to their future self, on an average of just 9 days long, like 9 days ahead. Healthy controls referred to a future that was on average 4.7 years long. So if you're addicted to drugs or substances, you don't even have like a long-term plan. You're just thinking like how to get to the next day, that immediate gratification, there's no delayed. People that have forward thinking, planners, wanting to get ahead, they show that they have obviously less addiction, or the people that are less addicted, they have the ability to forward plan, which is pretty crazy. So there's a big difference that illustrates how our temporal horizons shrink when we're under the sway of an addictive drug. Now, here's the last category that we were talking about, and it's called categorical strategies. Now, this is when we simply limit consumption by sorting dopamine into different categories. Those subtypes that will allow ourselves to consume and those that we don't. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit more about this, but this method is going to help us avoid not only the drug of choice, but it also triggers that lead to the craving of our drug. So the strategy is especially useful, by the way, for substances that we can't eliminate altogether, but that we're trying to consume in a healthier way, like food, sex, and smartphones. Here's an example with gamblers, for example, that do sports betting. They might also have to avoid watching sports on TV or reading the sports page in the newspaper or surfing sports-related internet sites and listening to sports radio, because all of those things drive themselves back into that habit loop that they don't want. So by avoiding substances and behaviors beyond the drug of choice, you can use this categorical strategy to mitigate the risk or relapse to sports betting. The one thing you have to be careful about, though, is when using this strategy, sometimes we can inadvertently trigger in our list of acceptable activities. We can correct these mistakes, though, like we've done in the past with the dopamine fasting, creating some mindfulness, creating some processes to check and balance ourselves about what's happening. And what about the category that itself changes? So for example, if you're dieting, many folks will eliminate gluten for a host of reasons, intolerance, celiac disease, leaky gut, all these things. But when the market then creates thousands of gluten-free products loaded with calories that are just as processed as before, we may have a problem. And so the same thing with medicines such as OxyContin, which is just like heroin. People are just taking that, saying like, oh, it's just OxyContin. Or they're smoking weed. We used to like say, oh, this is cannabis. And now it's like, no, this is just medicinal marijuana. So be very careful about how these categorical strategies you might be subverted from the forces that be. So be very careful of some of those things. It might trap you back into the negative habit loop that you're actually trying to avoid because it's similar but different, if that makes sense. I hope this was helpful for you guys and and really impactful just with explaining why these addictions occur, the dopamine pathways that are enroded in us. And so this is why I love to talk about the brain and what's happening, because when you start to understand this better, you realize, wow, like it's really not like I'm not a bad person. Like we're actually made up this way. And some of us just fall into the loop a lot easier, and we don't even know why. So I think when you have awareness, you can actually make changes. I've got a book coming out, a kid's book called Dad Put the Phone Down. It's going to talk exactly about this. It's kind of poking some humor at us dads and humans and how addicted we are. And then at the end, it's going to kind of tie in some of the learning lessons that I'm bringing in here. So look for that. And I hope you had an amazing week. If you need any help from me, never hesitate to reach out, and I'll see you guys next week.